Back in 1983, a little girl lived on my street. I remember her. I was even younger, only 3 or 4, but I remember her. She was a very sensitive girl. She was kind and caring in the daylight, but somehow sad and easily frightened when nightfall came. The older children still remember seeing her in the window of her bedroom when they played on the roads in the last few scraps of sun. Remember how we all did that when we were little kids? They all say she was never seen outside that late and that her face in the window always looked worried. What happened to her has become something of a local legend on this street. I don't know if I should be sharing it, but I'm going to. The story goes that whenever her parents put the little girl to bed, she begged them to keep just one light on. Just one. As it happens though, this wasn't just your typical childish fear of the dark. No. The little girl didn't care if the light was from her lamp or from the hall through a crack left in her bedroom door. She didn't even care if she could see the light. She just needed to know that it was on, that somewhere in her parents' house, at least one light was left on. In the living room downstairs, in her parents' room, out on the porch, anywhere. The little girl's mom and dad grew terribly concerned. Their daughter was developing a phobia that they knew they had to nip in the bud if it was going to grow into a complex and cause havoc later in life. All that sort of psychological talk was common in the 1980s. So the mom and dad decided to take turns to go downstairs long after their daughter should have been sleeping and to turn off whatever appliance was still emitting light. That was the plan anyway. Turns out it never worked because the first time the girl's dad went downstairs and flicked off the last lit lamp in the house, the girl woke up on the floor above. Her screaming filled the air and her mother rushed to her room. She was standing on the bed, and even by the time the father arrived, having run up the stairs 2 at a time, the little girl was still screaming and crying for them to turn the light back on. She begged them, please, please to turn the light back on. This went on for a long time. The girl reached 9 years old, then 10. Her parents had taken her to doctors and shrinks at 3 hospitals. Every avenue had been exhausted, from tests on her skin for acute light sensitivity, which came back negative, to sessions with hypnotherapists attempting to reveal the ugly face in the darkness that the little girl hadn't seen but was afraid of seeing in the total absence of light. Nothing worked. Nothing but that one light, any one light, that the little girl wouldn't allow them to switch off. When light was on, she slept like a baby, and in the end, the parents gave up and just accepted the abnormality as a routine. Everything went on as normal on our street. That is, until the night the power cut. The whole grid went out. My house, my own parents tell me, was plunged into darkness, and all the neighbors' houses too. Folks around here still remember the little girl screaming. It carried out of her house this time and pierced the whole neighborhood like an alarm. We lit our candles and took out our battery-operated torches, and by the time we were done, it must have taken us about 15 minutes. The little girl had stopped screaming. My neighbors tell me there was a bit of a carnival atmosphere. Everyone hunched around a naked flame and white torchlight, telling ghost stories and forgetting entirely about the screams of the little girl. The next artificial lights anyone on my street saw were the red and blue police lights flashing over our walls and windows as the car raced past us one by one and stopped. Yes, you know what I'm going to say. Stopped at the little girl's house, the little girl who had begged her parents for light. The police gained access to the property through the broken glass panel in the back door. Shards littered the vestibule and the kitchen. Little pieces of glass twinkled in the light all the way upstairs to the parents' bedroom. When police found the mom and the dad, their throats had been cut. The whole bed and most of the floor was red and wet. But it was nothing a seasoned officer hadn't encountered before. For something that really did turn even the most experienced guts, though, there was what happened to the little girl herself. Her face was unrecognizable as a normal 10-year-old's face. The coroner said later that when the intruder had been removing her teeth from her jaw, she'd still been awake, still screaming for help, and that accounted for the splatter patterns on her nightdress. Eventually, she lost consciousness due to shock, and the blood had gathered in her throat and choked her to death. Afterward, 2 3-inch long nails had been driven straight through her lids into her eyes. It was like someone was trying to keep her permanently in the dark. As you can imagine, folks around here don't talk much about the little girl who begged her parents for light. But when they do talk, some say her lifelong screaming was actually precognition of the night when all the lights would go out, the night of the power cut. Like she'd known, somewhere deep, deep down, that on that night, a man would come and smash his fist through the glass panel on the back door, and that he'd bring a tool bag with him, and the tool bag would bring the most awful pain. Me, myself, I don't know. But I know enough to do a few things before I ever go to sleep. They say the little girl, or whatever's left of her, is still in that house on my street. They say some nights she wanders. They say if you ever find yourself, for some unknown reason, lying down in bed in a spot where you don't usually lie, it's because the little girl who begged for light is lying next to you. If you can, don't move. Don't let her know that you know she's there. Just reach out to the nearest light and put it on. Do it before she starts screaming. Now to start this off, I'm a 29-year-old man, and 3 times a year I head up to the Georgia mountains to camp, fish, and have a great time. But after the last trip, I doubt I will ever go again. I had been super excited the week before heading up to Georgia, and when the day finally came, I could have died with happiness. I loaded up my dog Buddy and all my gear and started the trip. About an hour into my trip, I saw a road that I've never been on before. I decided I would take an hour to look around and go back to the main road. I lost track of time, and before I knew it, the sun was setting. I grabbed my gear and Buddy, and we hiked about 10 minutes before finding a nice clearing in the forest. I set up camp and looked around my camp. I saw a small, man-made trail leading into the dark trees and decided that Buddy and I needed a walk. I grabbed my walking stick, Buddy's leash, and a headlamp, and we headed onto the trail. I knew something was wrong when I couldn't hear a single insect or animal. Buddy and I stopped at a little creek when I saw something terrifying. 2 eyes reflecting from my headlamp. This thing was really like 6 or 7 feet, and the eyes were too big to be human. My dog is usually very protective of me, but instead of barking or doing something, he whimpered and peed on my leg. I've never seen him act like this before. He's seen bears before and has scared mountain lions away, but he never peed like this. As Buddy kept whimpering, I felt terrible, like this thing hated me and it could rip me to shreds if it wanted to. Then it made the scariest noise I've ever heard. It sounded like a maniac screaming. Buddy and I bolted back to our camp. In our camp, I could still hear the thing. I packed up the camp as Buddy stood to watch. We ran to my truck and got out of there. I went straight home and didn't sleep that whole night. Later on, I looked on the internet at what could have made that noise, and nothing came close to it. I really don't know what that was, but there is something weird in the woods of Georgia. I may not be any kind of expert, but I believe there's more to this world than we mere humans can hope to understand. I've always had a very fine-tuned sense for what I believe to be those unexplainable things, moments where I feel something I can't quite explain with any rationality. Later in life, I would be told to have what can most easily be explained as some kind of weak psychic or supernatural energy by a Wiccan witch. Nothing too impressive, but just enough to let me feel those entities even if I cannot see them, like the ghost in my grandparents' guest room or the malicious entity haunting the stairs and basement garage. The same uncanny sixth sense that my mom observed when my younger brother was born, stronger than her own maternal sense to the point I understood when my brother needed something before even he knew and could make a sound, even waking minutes before him in the middle of the night without fail. But I think there may be more to it than that, as this incident leads me to believe. My family had recently moved to British Columbia that winter. I was 10 at the time. While we were by no means in the boonies, we moved into an older trailer near a well-known hiking trail and a small Christmas tree farm. Immediately, there was something off about the area, something that my parents waved off as new home anxiety or just not being used to the place yet. I did my best to put it out of my mind, but within 2 weeks of the move, I began to notice strange happenings. Firstly, the unsettling aura I just couldn't shake. I had sleepless nights where I felt like I was being watched by something at my window. There were strange shadows that were there 1 second and then gone the next. There were soft voices whispering my name, and this happened only when I was alone in my room near the window. However, whenever these incidents happened, I would feel something brushing against my shins and ankles. That lessened the aura, at least for a while. These instances would be near constant until I struck out on my own 8 years later. But it all came to head that fall, months after the move. My parents insisted we take a family walk on the mountain trail. I didn't want to because I am by no means an outdoorsman. Something in me screamed not to go and that it was dangerous. But being barely 11, of course, my parents completely dismissed my concerns. They called it being lazy. So we were off to the trail's main entrance. As soon as I set foot out of the car, the warning bells in my head were blaring louder. Something in me kept saying we had to leave, that something bad was going to happen. The little voice in my head kept focusing on my diabetic mom, who at the time had a weight problem, and my dad with his disability that made him outright unable to run. Also, my bad lungs would make it impossible to run myself. The three of us were sitting ducks. I didn't know why I was so hyper-focused on running, on needing to get away. We were halfway through the walk when suddenly I froze. The apprehension I had felt about the whole event ramped up to 11. My parents thought I stopped because I was tired and took the opportunity to take pictures of the lovely fall leaves and dappled sunlight. It was a gorgeous sight, but I knew something was there, watching us, and it was not something we wanted to meet. I looked around, trying to find whatever was setting me off. All I saw was an occasional fleeting shadow. I could feel the brushing, but the feeling of dread and fear only got stronger. Whatever it was close. If it came at us, we wouldn't stand a chance, and I still didn't know what in the world it was. My parents still hadn't noticed something was wrong, and I felt my voice catch in my throat, not out of fear, but as if something wasn't letting me speak. I heard the leaves rustle. It was close, really close. I glanced where the noise was coming from and saw a shadow for a split second before it vanished behind a tree. And as it vanished, something changed. It was hot. It felt like a volcano had erupted in my chest. Not like the slow, gentle ooze like one might see in Hawaii, but explosive, angry, spewing burning clouds of toxic gas and ash, spraying molten rock and fire. I was still afraid, but I wasn't frozen. I was angry, eyes locked on the area I'd seen the shadow. I was no stranger to anger. I am an aggressive woman and always have been, but this rage was entirely new. The feeling against my legs stopped, but the fire was burning hotter. And the dangerous thing hiding just outside my field of view. It felt like my body was controlled by something else. Still me, but different. I convinced my parents to pick up the pace, practically speed walking the rest of the loop, not daring to let the fire sparked in my chest die out until we were safely back at the car. The strange presence lingered, much further off but still watching, still malicious but almost curious now. We left the trail and never went back. A few weeks later, my mom found out she would be having my brother. As time passed, the whole incident kept nagging at my mind, and I felt myself doing research from time to time to try to piece together whatever happened. While I may never fully understand, I think I finally have part of an answer. I think I was protecting my brother. As I stated earlier, I have always had an unexplainable connection to him despite being so much older and a terrifyingly vicious protective streak over him. When this happened, my mom would have been a month or so into her pregnancy. I think that whatever is in me that allows me to feel these presences so clearly was so immediately focused on my mom and dad getting away, with myself as an afterthought. It knew he was there long before anyone else did. The phantom touches? As ridiculous as I feel saying it, I believe it was a guardian angel of sorts, or more accurately my protective, then long dead childhood cat keeping up his station even in death. The brushing feeling was identical to the feeling of a cat weaving around your legs, and only stopped entirely when I moved out and got my own kitten, who just as suddenly and uncharacteristically adopted the same guarding behavior. What that fire was, I may never know, but I know for a fact it was what kept that thing away. What was that thing? I believe it was a Wendigo, or maybe a skinwalker, and I believed it had been hunting me and continued to hunt me since we moved to that town and until I moved away. The voices, the feeling of being watched, the fear of fire. I can't believe it was anything but. While I know the creatures will stalk their desired prey for a long time, that thing always comes back whenever I visit my family. Regardless of what it is, skinwalker or otherwise, it fixated on me. It seems I'm safe so as long as I have this fire. But I wonder why after so many years it still follows me whenever I enter what must be its territory. Remembering that feeling of malice, I pray I never have to find out. I'm a male that lives in the far northeast of the U.S. Every late summer, I take me and my dog Spud on a 3-day hiking and camping trip. We've been doing this for about 4 years now and always have a great time. He loves the fresh air and room to run. We usually end up far off trails where no one is likely to stumble upon us. I prefer it just be me and him. This time, we traveled a little further to a state forest we hadn't been to before. It was beautiful. The foliage was dense, and the leaves were only barely starting to change color. So the whole area was a verdant green with a dotting of amber leaves. We had been hiking for a good 6 hours, and I knew it would begin to get dark soon, so I started looking for a potential spot to camp. We walked about 2 miles off the main trail before we entered a clearing. The grass was beautiful, even fairly short for not having seen much human activity. Across the clearing on the far side was a large tree that I was not familiar with in the slightest. It looked almost like a white oak tree, but I know those are not really native to this area. It's just the closest thing that comes to mind. I wasn't too keen on setting up near the tree because even from a distance, I could tell there were weird carvings made into the trunk and even some burn marks on the ground near it, which meant someone had likely been there fairly recently. The light was beginning to fade fast, and even though Spud whimpered, we settled into lower grass surrounding the massive tree. I made a small fire from some small twigs and logs. We didn't need it to go all night, just enough to cook. After a meal of canned stew, a couple of shots of whiskey while waiting for the stew to heat, and a can of chopped prime rib dog food Spud just adores, we settled into my jumbo sleeping bag. He likes to lay on top, so I bring a warm blanket to cover him with as well. He paced back and forth for a while, whimpering before settling down for the night. I woke up at probably close to 3 a.m. with Spud whining and barking. The only light at this point was coming from the moon, dimly shining through thick clouds. So I reached into my sleeping bag to grab my flashlight. After a couple of clicks, of course, it was dead despite me having replaced the batteries before the trip. Just then, the whole ground started to rumble. Having never been in an earthquake, I'm not sure if that description does it justice. I called Spud over to me and held onto his collar because, without adequate light, I was at the mercy of whatever was producing that sound. There was a loud cracking and moaning and what sounded like large branches snapping. As me and Spud both huddled together, scared senseless, it seemed like the noise was moving away from us and not toward us. Within about 30 minutes, the sound had almost completely stopped. I lay there for probably another hour before I finally fell asleep, exhausted from the long hike the day before and the nervous breakdown I nearly had. As soon as sunlight touched my face, I sprang awake, looking around. Spud crawled out from below his blanket. As I stood and surveyed the area, something became immediately clear. The large tree was gone. There was no large hole, no branches laying around, not even leaves cluttering the ground. It's as if it had never been there in the first place. That was it. Either I was losing my mind, or a huge tree just walked away in the middle of the night. I packed a few things I had brought, whistled for Spud, and we cut our camping trip a day short. I will never return to that forest again. I'm almost afraid to even camp now without a large group, and I will never hike in the evening again. I grew up in a small town in Massachusetts where the term Minuteman was coined during the Revolutionary War, so there's definitely a lot of history there. My mom and I moved into an apartment complex when I was 3, and we're both really excited to have our own little place. I'm 35 now and can remember all of this so vividly like it was just yesterday. I remember having problems sleeping immediately after we moved in. I developed night terrors and will wake up in the middle of the night at the exact same time, 3 a.m., experiencing utter terror. I was so young that I couldn't rationalize what was going on and would scream for my mother to come get me and take me to a room every night at the same time this happened. It'd be like I was woken up out of a sound sleep because of sheer terror and just had to get out of that room. This continued for the next 2 years. At this point, I'm 5 years old. This one particular night, I went to bed and woke up, as you guessed, at 3 a.m. So I'm just laying in bed, but only this time, I'm not screaming for my mother. I'm laying there, waiting, as if something is going to happen. I can sense it. All of a sudden, in the pure silence of the night, I hear the knob turn, and the door to my room opened, and the door just glided extremely slowly across the carpeted floor. Something in my gut told me not to look. I knew if I looked, whatever I saw looking back at me would ruin me forever. So I just laid there, quietly staring at the wall while avoiding looking at the door. All of a sudden, the door slams shut. I lay there in fear, but eventually fell asleep after rocking myself to sleep. When I woke up that morning, I immediately asked my mother if she went in to check on me last night. She said no, because she had been asleep herself. The look of terror on my face must have been one for the books because someone or something definitely opened that door last night. I was awake. I know I was. I heard that door open and physically felt someone standing there looking at me. If it wasn't my mom, then who was it? It was just the two of us living there. So I try to forget this experience and go on with my life. Now my mom loved having fish tanks and all varieties of fish since we weren't allowed to have other pets where we lived. The fish would just keep dying. I know fish die, and it could be a total coincidence, but my mom knew how to take care of them, and it was just odd how frequently it was happening. We came home one day, and all of them were dead. All of them. My mom just shrugged and said she had no idea what happened, and chalked it off to bacteria or something in the water. That's not what I think it was. I went to bed that night and woke up, you guessed it, at the same time, 3 a.m. I groggily looked over to the closet, which was directly across from my bed, and saw, through the darkness, a huge black shadow or black mass just hovering over the closet. This thing was massive and the blackest black I had ever seen to this day. I was paralyzed with fear and screamed for my mother, who rushed in to see what was wrong. And to my horror, she saw it too. She hurriedly turned the light on, and the black mass was still hovering over the closet. Looking back as an adult now, I know how terrified she must have been. She didn't want me to be scared though, and I commend her for this. So she just got in my bed, pulled the covers up over us both, and held me close until we both finally fell asleep. To this day, I have no idea what we saw that night, or what was actually happening there. I don't think whatever was there had good intentions for us, and we ultimately moved not long after that. It frightens me to think that something was actually watching me on all those sleepless nights and just preying on my innocence. Unfortunately, my mom is not here to validate the story anymore, but I did ask her about it about 10 years ago, and she definitely remembered, but could not explain it. I could tell she was uncomfortable talking about it. I was hoping she said she didn't remember so it could be chalked off to my young, wild imagination, but her confirming that these things actually happened chills me to the core to this day. I remember this like it was yesterday because, well, for me, it was. It was July 22nd, 2011. I had just gotten married to my beautiful wife at the beginning of the month. I was just 34 years old. Have you ever wrote your thoughts down, knowing you're legally dead? Neither have I until now. As I said, it was July 2011, and I had only been married a couple of weeks. One day, while my wife took a nap, I decided to take a walk. Right across from my house, across the street, is nothing but woods. According to Google Earth, the woods go on for a while. I may have been walking for about 30 to 45 minutes when I heard a noise. Now, I'm not the guy who believes in ghosts or Bigfoot, and I'm not worried about other people because I always have a knife or gun on me. I'm just not easily scared. The noise I heard wasn't like a twig snapping, leaves crunching, or rocks falling. It was more of a splash. So I followed the sound, and it led me to a small clearing. I saw a creek, but the water wasn't clear like you normally see. Instead, it was a light greenish color. It had a glow, and fog rose from it. It was like nothing I had ever seen before in person, only in horror or sci-fi movies. As I was looking at the creek and all of its weird wonders, I heard the splash again. I followed the sound with my eyes and saw a downed tree. I saw parts of a person's left hand. I immediately ran over and dropped to my knees to help this guy. What I saw next still sticks with me to this day. As the guy raised his head and what I thought was to take a breath, he cut his eyes at me. Halfway still in the water, a smile formed on his face. Just as fast as I saw him, he was gone. Just disappeared into the air. Gone. No trace of him at all. Then, in what I'm guessing was about an hour, I woke up. I know what you're thinking. It was all just a dream, but just wait, hear me out here. I was still in the same spot I fell asleep in, the same spot this guy was in. I jump up, still feeling a bit dazed, and headed home. A million things were running through my mind, knowing my wife was not going to believe what just had happened to me. I just knew I was going to be in trouble. Finally make it home and try to open the door, but my key wouldn't work. Okay, this is weird, I thought. Suddenly, a guy opens the door and asks, "Can I help you?" Keep in mind, I have never seen this guy before. I asked him who he was, why he was in my house, and where in the world is my wife? Looking confused, he answered, "Son, we have lived in this house for 8 years. We moved in 2011. Even more confused, I asked, "What do you mean? It is 2011. My wife and I just bought this house earlier this month." And about this time, a woman walked up to him. I can only assume it was his wife, and she whispered something into his ear. About the same time, a cop was pulling into the driveway, and I'm guessing that's what she was telling him, that she had called the police. They took my wallet, knife, and gun and placed them on the hood of the squad car. The police questioned me and the other guy separately, comparing our stories in just as much confusion as we had. The other guy gave the police all the proper paperwork to prove his side and was released to go back inside of his home. All of the attention was then turned back to me. I told them I was not crazy, to just look in my wallet. I told them to look at my ID and to look at the serial number on my gun, that neither would lie. They opened my wallet and laid everything out. There was nothing there but old newspaper clippings and nothing in particular. No ID was there. The serial number on the gun came back clean. It was not stolen, but there was also no name of the owner either. Frustrated, I said, "Look, it's been a long day. Can you just drive me to my father-in-law's house so he can clear this all up?" The police officers looked at each other, then back at me, and said, "Sure." 15 minutes later, we pulled into my father-in-law's driveway. A smile came across my face, and I breathed a sigh of relief like a brick was taken off of my chest. Everything was as I explained it to the officers, and soon everything was going to be okay. One of the officers knocked on my father-in-law's door to talk to him as the other officer and I waited outside. A few minutes later, the officer and my father-in-law walked outside to join us. My father-in-law looked at me with tears in his eyes. He said, "Sir, this officer told me everything that is going on. I can't imagine what you are going through. I don't know how to tell you this, but I don't know you. I did have a daughter, but she died in a car accident about 4 years ago. She had never been married and didn't have any children. I don't know how you know these things about me or what kind of sick game this is, but you need to leave. My heart sank. What in the world is going on? I thought. The officers apologized, thanked him for his time, and we left. I asked where we were going, to which they replied, to the station to figure this out. I begged them for one last try, for them to please call my dad. If anyone could make sense of this, it was going to be my dad. I gave the officer my dad's information, his name and number, the whole 9 yards. They pulled over, called him, and told him everything. You could hear my dad yelling. He definitely wasn't happy, and he too thought this was nothing but a sick joke. He screamed, "I have no idea who this guy is, or how he knows me. The only son I've ever had, my ex-wife miscarried over 30 years ago. I suffer from that loss daily, and what y'all are doing to me is wrong, sick, and twisted." There were a few choice words screamed as well before he hung up on the officer. So I sit here in this mental hospital, or asylum, whatever you want to call it, as nothing more than John Doe. I'm not writing this thinking anyone will believe me, because no one has. I'm writing this in hopes that the right person will read this and will know who I am. This story doesn't involve me, but rather my grandfather. He was the one person in my humongous family I respected the most. His experience has taught me a lot. Anyway, he was part of our country's army in the 1970s. He doesn't like to talk much about his army experiences, in particular this one. As far as I know, he has only told me, and for a reason. He was sent to a special force mission in Vietnam. He and 7 more soldiers were sent to explore an unidentified underground tunnel system in Vietnam. He said that they knew only that it was used during the war for the Vietnamese soldiers to surprise the Americans. It was at least a 10-kilometer plus tunnel system, and they needed every corner to be researched in 1 week's time. It was a cold November Thursday. My granddad and 2 more soldiers were on duty to go into the system. The rest were up on the surface by a campfire. Anyway, as they went in, it got weirder and weirder. It got more unpleasant and ominous as they took each step. There were occasionally those metal doors on the walls that led into often a communication room or a restroom with bunk beds. As they were nearing what looked like another exit, my grandpa heard those sharp scratching noises like someone was rubbing a knife on those walls. It sounded very disturbing, and apparently his fellow soldiers heard it too. They finally reached a metal door. This one was giving foreshadows from the beginning. First, it was black, and the rest of the doors in the tunnels were dark green. Second, it was slightly open, which was very unusual. Third, it released this disgusting smell of something rotten. My grandpa decided to enter first. He opened the door and clicked on the flashlight. What he told me he saw left me sleepless for months. On the ground, there were at least 15 bodies, not skeletons, but fresh bodies scattered around the room. When he looked up, he saw a black figure glued to the wall, facing him. My granddad smashed the door and ran as he shouted for the other 2 to follow him. As they were nearing the exit, they heard the horrifying scream that echoed across the tunnels. When they exited, they realized they were on the other side of the camp. When they reached the campfire with the others, they all looked confused and said they heard a scream. That scream was so loud it echoed across at least 3 kilometers of tunnel systems and reached the others. After a brief explanation, all 8 soldiers went back around through the same exit and reached the same back door. It was on the floor like it was blasted with dynamite. When they looked inside, they saw nothing but bloody bunk beds. My grandfather knew what he saw that night, and I'm obliged to believe him. This happened about 3 years ago, and it was during one of my little road trip phases that I had when I moved to the city from my little hometown down south. It was spring break of 2018. My teenage antics were at an all-time high, as I was only a sophomore in high school at the time. Needless to say, my friends and I were quite avid users of alcohol respectively, not that I endorsed its use or anything. I mean, we were just teens at the time. I had just made the trip down to my hometown and was relaxing at my friend's house when my friend, who I was staying with at the time, suggested that we should take a camping trip and have some fun since I was down there for the break. My friend's name is Doug, by the way, and our other friends invited to this trip were Lewis and Isaiah, while I go by the name Eric. Doug had found this really cool camping spot out by the lake that neither I, Lewis, nor Isaiah had ever been to. Needless to say, I'm an outdoorsy person and was excited about the whole thing. I was not even the slightest bit aware of what awaited us. On the second day of my trip back to my town of youth, we had decided to head out early in the morning and pack a couple of beers and hard liquor bottles in the cooler with our camping materials. This was a small town, mind you, so getting these things were as easy as taking candy from a baby. Since I was the only one with the license at the time, it was my responsibility to drive us, and since I was staying with Doug, that meant we only had to pick up Lewis and Isaiah on the way. We began the drive to the camping spot, which was about a good 45-minute drive from where our town was located. We blasted the tunes of uncanny rappers and nonchalant trap music that every teen was listening to at the time, although I wish I had better taste in music. We drove past the trees that winded down the sides of our road leading out of town, and almost always they would encompass the sunlight beaming overhead with their tall, sprawling branches. We cleared the woods into an opening of farm fields on both sides while we were following an old road that had a turnoff which one direction led to the highway, whilst the other led to an older, run-down, much smaller town than ours that led to the lake we were driving to. Without a second thought, I put the turn signal on, leading on the road opposite of the highway, which leads to a much more dense and dark forest. The trees blocked most of the sunlight just as the others did, but this was much more noticeable as we had barely enough sunlight to not turn our headlights on. The road turned to dirt, and the rocks could be heard bouncing off the side of my tires nonchalantly. We passed the first few houses and immediately noticed there was something off about these houses. It wasn't that they were old trailers or anything, it's just that they all had tin-like chimneys that were pumping out smoke in the air, and it was the beginning of spring, so it wasn't even that cold. We continued down the old dirt path that led to the lake. After passing the rest of the houses down that road, we noticed that almost all houses had that same tin-like chimney with smoke blowing out the top. We arrived at the spot near the lake, and needless to say, it was a pretty cool spot since it was the only spot that had a bit of opening in its trees on one side due to the lake being right next to us. The dirt path that led to the spot wound around in a circle, and in the middle there was a tiny grass patch with 3 tiny trees surrounding it. I parked my car next to the middle of the circle, and we decided to set up our tent near the patch with our soon-to-be camping fire in the middle of the patch. We split into 2 groups. Me and Doug were to gather firewood while Lewis and Isaiah gathered rocks to make the pit. Me and Doug headed in the direction opposite the lake, where the ever so dense forest awaited us with open arms to gather our sticks and leaves. "You meet any cute chicks up in the city yet? Or are you still too much a wimp to ask for their number?" Doug said. "You know me, man, it's always the latter." He laughed, and I shrugged it off with a chuckle, as it's usually his motive to tease me since we are friends after all. As we gathered our firewood, Doug casually looks up from his task and notices something up ahead in the tall grass, which almost surpassed our shoulders at this point. "You see that rusty old truck up there?" Doug asked. I looked up and saw what he alluded to and said, "You mean that old rust bucket?" "Yeah, I see it. I wonder who left it here." We casually picked up the remainder of the firewood and headed back to our camping spot. Dusk was beginning to set in, and it was about at this time that we cracked open the cooler full of liquor and sat down at the bristling campfire we made to accompany us. We sat in our circle, telling god-awful horror stories, and failed attempts at getting the ladies, all while laughing and having a good time as we sipped our beers and broke out the shots. My body count is at least 10 by now, but I'm not sure since I stopped counting, Lewis boasted. "So what? You can't count now, mister. I've slept with 10 people, but I'm not counting." Isaiah laughed. "Be honest, though. You really think we studying math?" Doug exclaimed. You know, guys, I say we toast to that," I slurred. We all laughed and raised our beers in unison. The darkness around the campfire and the surrounding woods had completely set in at this point, and to say the least, we were all fairly drunk since at this point we were all walking a straight line across the campfire acting as if we could pass a sobriety test. Doug falls next to the log we were sitting on, and Lewis, as well as Isaiah, followed suit while I wasn't exactly getting a grasp on our makeshift sobriety test and kept stumbling and falling over next to them as they laughed at my effort. Shut up, guys, and cut me some slack. I took a deep, long breath and exhaled with a bloated face as I could feel the alcohol lingering in my throat. I immediately felt a sudden urge to go vomit, so I told them I would be right back, and they laughed even harder since they figured what I was going to go do. I made it all the way to where the tall grass was and let my stomach do the talking. I didn't notice how dark the surrounding area actually was until I finished my business and turned back to see the campfire in the distance, which looked like a small speck compared to what surrounded us. Just then, I heard a rustling in the woods and turned around with my phone in hand and turned the flash on to see what caused the ruckus. I, being drunk at the time, literally had no thoughts in my mind, and being curious, I decided to go check it out and ventured a bit deeper into the grass with the dark of the branches looming all around me. I stubbed my toe against what seemed like a rock, and I almost let out a screech until I settled down and shrugged it off. I pulled my flash up to see what it was, and lo and behold, it was the front tire of the truck me and Doug had found earlier. I raised the flash a bit higher and got a better view of the whole truck and its layout. It was a rusty old green Ford, probably 90s or so, with a raised bed cover and windows on the side of the cover with a cracked glass on almost every one. I raised my flash a bit higher towards the front cab of the truck and peered inside, seeing old newspapers, crushed up beer cans, and strangely enough, a few needles lying on the floorboard. That's when my curiosity simmered down a bit, and my fear began to set in as I shifted my attention towards a sound that came from the back of the cab and the bed cover. I slowly walked, with every grass and leaf crunching under my feet as if each step were 1,000 guns being shot at the same time. I reached the back of the cab and shakily raised my flash up the side of the truck and into the window of the back cab. The flashlight peered up the glass of the window, and as I raised it higher, my heart sank into complete and utter terror. What peered out of the glass at me was a man with eyes that had no pupils and a smile that only a man on the edge of sanity could perform. He banged his arms against the glass, and the shock of the sound sent me flying onto the back into the grass and dropping my phone. I frantically grabbed my phone from the ground and without a second thought raised the light back to the man only to see him banging on the window with much force. His arms were bleeding as he had needles sticking out of both arms. His shirt tattered with years of misfortune and his face meshed with scars. He began to bulge his eyes from his sockets as he laughed horribly and began to cry hysterically. "I knew you would come! It's you! About time you brought the fun to me!" I let out a blood-curdling scream, and with my heart racing a mile a minute, I wasted no time in hightailing it from the truck back to the campfire. I turned around to see the man get out of the truck, and he turned to face me, tilting his head with his murderous smile and deep white eyes illuminating through the moonlight that shined down as he began to walk towards me. My running turned to sprint, and I ended up slamming into the campfire that we set up, which made me fall face first into the gravel and dirt. The fire was now on its last legs and was almost out at this point. However, my legs were now caught in a bit of the flame. With my frantic rolling about on the ground, the fire on my pants was almost instantly put out. "Eric, what's going on?" Doug shouted. I looked up at the three who were in complete fear at this point and oblivious as to what lied in the woods just beside us. There's a man in the woods, and the truck. The truck that we found. Out of breath, I said it fast as I could get it out. That's when our attention shifted towards the truck in the tall grass. Two headlights beamed out of the grass and the truck engine roared to life ferociously. All of our hearts sank and we instantly sobered up and realized the direness of our situation. "Get in the car!" Lewis shouted. Me, Doug, and Isaiah looked at each other in frantic agreement and booked it into the car and locked the doors as soon as we got inside. Breathing heavily and shaking from what lied in the dark of the woods, we all agreed to start the car and get out of the Dodge. We started the car only to find the headlights of the truck began to move and encircle us around our campsite. "Just put it in drive before he rams us," Isaiah shouted. I floored the accelerator and hightailed it from our camping spot, leaving the tent and booze behind because at this point, it didn't even matter. The truck began to follow us and steadily gained speed on us as we began our death race toward the exit of the woods. The houses we had seen earlier all had their lights on, and with each house, there was someone standing in the dark with the light illuminating behind them. All of them standing there just watching us. Every single one. What is this? I shouted. The trees seemed as if they grew 100 feet higher and now fully encased us within these woods, and the darkness felt as if it was chasing us out of its home and screaming at us in agony. The truck behind us was almost touching my bumper at this point, and when I peered in the rearview mirror, I saw the man one last time. His eyes were stabbing mine as if to say, "I will kill you." His pupils were non-existent, and his smile somehow seemed more impossibly forced than before, and he was laughing to the point of insanity. I thought this was the end for us. Suddenly, we shot out from the dark of the woods and into the open farm fields from earlier, and the truck behind us slammed his brakes, and we could hear him screech his tires so loudly it felt like it busted our eardrums. I looked in the mirror to see the truck slowly creep back into the forest from which it came, the darkness swallowing it up once again. We didn't play any music the rest of the way home, nor did we speak a word to each other about what had just happened. Our heart rates were all up from the moment we pulled into Doug's driveway. When we got out, we let out a sigh of relief. We each made our way to his shed where he stays, and we all grabbed waters and some food to calm us down. We watched some comedies to try to take our minds off of the events that had just transpired. Due to the constant laughing of the movies and shows we watched, I had to step outside as I thought I was having a panic attack. All I could hear was that man laughing at me hysterically. "I knew it was you." I shook my head and took long, deep breaths and headed back inside. I still keep in touch with these friends. Even though high school has all but ended, they are still my closest friends and probably always will be. Although I've still yet to find my groove with the ladies, and much hasn't changed since then, one thing will never change. I will never forget the pure white of that man's eyes as well as his murderous smile. One thing that bothers me until this very day is the fact that me and Doug noticed the truck very early on in the day. The man watched us for hours, and I can't help but to think about what those people were doing on the porches, just staring at us, not doing anything. Was this all coordinated? Were they just too scared of the man? Or were they just like the man and wanted this corner of the globe to stay all to themselves? Well, in any case, you win. You can keep those woods to yourselves. I don't know if this is paranormal or a glitch in the matrix, but all I know is that it messed me up for quite a while. So about a year ago, it was a windy summer evening, probably like 4 p.m., and I decided to go for a walk by myself. When I walk literally anywhere, I'm constantly aware of my surroundings. I'm a true crime fanatic here. I look over my shoulder every once in a while, so I looked behind me a few times and didn't see anyone. But when I looked another time, I saw a group of boys behind me. There were like probably 6 of them, and 1 or 2 were on skateboards. Now I have bad social anxiety, so I started speed walking, and I heard them laughing and started talking pretty loudly. Me having social anxiety, I automatically thought they were laughing at me, and I was really shaken. To make it easier to understand, let me tell you the layout of my neighborhood. It's shaped like a Y. My house is the very first house at the entrance of the Y. When you drive down, there is a stop sign where you can choose to go left or right. I had walked left and was coming back that way, and right at the left, there were a group of trees that make a little cave kinda, so all the kids in the know call it the hideout. So I came around the corner speed walking back to my house, and when I looked back another time, they were just about to pass the hideout. I looked one last time before I booked it to my house, and they were gone. Just completely gone. When I got back to my house, I told my older brother about seeing a bunch of random teens walking, and he wanted to go walk and see if he could see them, and they were just gone. Literally gone. Now there are 3 houses that the boys could have come from, and at the time it took for me and my brother to walk, we would have seen them, and me living at the entrance, we would have seen them leave. I truly have no idea what to make of it. Tell me if I'm crazy and that they just went back to their houses, or if something did glitch. Now to start this off, I'm a 22-year-old dude with loads of energy. This will be relevant later. So much so I usually take midnight walks around my house to get me ready for bed. I cannot sleep before 2 a.m. My parents recently told me that they were going on vacation and needed a house sitter. Being the cheap parents they were, they asked me to watch their cabin in some random forest 30 miles to the nearest town and 3 miles from the nearest neighbor. Cabin in the middle of nowhere, all alone, with a lakefront view? Who could say no? I told them goodbye and wished them luck in their trip, and I arrived at the cabin the next day. First day went well because I thought they didn't have cable or service. Fortunately, I was wrong. They did. I fished, swam, and ate good food. But the second day is when the nightmares started. The time was about 1:08 in the morning, and I couldn't sleep at all. I put on my boots and headed out in the cool night air for a little walk. I walked around the house a couple of times and stood by the edge of the thick forest. Just when I was about to head back to my bed, I heard footsteps from the trees. Now I'm used to deer being everywhere around my house, but the footsteps sounded way heavier than a normal deer. Being the curious chap I was, I threw a rock in a thick bush to see if it would run off. It was silent at first, but then I heard something I wish I didn't. Laughing. Not from a normal person, but from someone who was insane. Then the same rock I threw was thrown right back at me. I never ran that fast in my truck in all my life. When I turned on my truck and the headlights came on, I could see a bald man still laughing where I was a second ago. I sped until I reached the end of our long driveway. I then called the sheriff and had to wait for about an hour. When they got there, they thought I was just joking, but when they checked where I told them to, they found rope, duct tape, a long knife, and a faint bloody trail leading to another cabin some far away into the trees. Inside was just a bunch of scribbles like a child does and a rag covered in blood. The police looked all around and even checked our cabin, but he was never found. The next day my parents canceled their trip and sold the place in less than 2 weeks. I find myself still wondering whose blood that was in that cabin and what would have happened if I didn't find the man in the woods. This story isn't mine, but my mom's. She's German and was born and grew up in Schenelager, West Germany. It was probably in the 1980s as my mom was a teenager, I'd say about 14 or 15. She was coming back from her friend's house and was walking back home. Where my mom's friend used to live was a little farm. During nighttime, it gets pitch black. My grandma lives and still lives in a flat on Bellefielder Street. And in order to get to the flat, you have to cross a road. Also on the opposite side of the road was a space where my dad parks his car when we go to visit. There's also a chapel if you go up on that little road. You can view this on Google Maps. A statue of 3 sheep and a shepherd should come up. So my mom came out of the opposite side, but not by the church when she saw a car driving very slowly on the opposite side of her. She can't remember what make or color, but it was very light. The man in the car was in his 50s. He had gray hair, but was bald at the top. Now my mom isn't stupid. This was on a Sunday, and in Germany, every single shop is closed on a Sunday. There was hardly anybody out and hardly any cars around. Everyone was inside. If anyone was out, it was for a walk or a bike ride. My mom pointed out that his license plate said he was from Celle, which is quite a drive away from Schenelager, and all he did was stare at her from the car window and then drove off. My mom obviously isn't stupid and was worried if she crossed over, he'd know where she lived. Thankfully, because she grew up there, she knew the streets like the back of her hand, so she wounded in and out through alleyways, and each time she would come out to a road, she saw him driving around looking for her. Finally, she came out from the opposite side, by the 3 sheep and shepherd statue. Because there were barely any cars, she bolted across the road to my grandma's flat. When she got up to the flat, she looked out the window to what used to be the dining room, which overlooked the road she just crossed. She saw the man drive past twice more and then never saw him again. The next day, either in the papers or television, it was on the news that a man from Celle in his 50s kidnapped, raped, and possibly murdered a boy, and they were on the search for him. My mom doesn't remember if she told her mom, and she doesn't know if they ever caught the man. I've tried looking up the case, but I can't find anything on it. I've heard this story a dozen times now, and it still scares me, but I bet it scares my mom even more. In October of 2019, I went to a Halloween costume ball hosted at our local art gallery, which was organized by a Unitarian Universalist spiritual center whose members I have close ties with. It was a typical party, but had a few ceremonial attributes to celebrate Samhain. I dressed up as the Red Death from Phantom of the Opera and basically went alone, thus waiting for a friend who did eventually come to meet up with me later in the night. Before that, I've had the most bizarre experience. Bizarre as in I was unable to imagine a clear explanation behind this certain circumstance. I still can't think of one to this day. So after dancing to the music and sipping a couple of drinks, I was interested enough to purchase a photographic aura reading from this lady at a little booth. I sat down and she instructed me to take off my skull mask and firmly lie my palms on a flat silver machine linked to her laptop. I was then instructed to look into a camera, and after a few minutes, my image appeared on the screen with a mix of transparent colors along with various measuring charts. I was further intrigued and listened to the lady's explanations concerning chakras and the like. As I was trying to pay attention to her, something in my peripheral vision distracted me a bit. I decided to look directly ahead, and to my surprise, a group of 4 sitting at a table was staring and smiling back at me. 3 men and 1 woman. If their expressions weren't friendly, then they were most definitely flirtatious. I can't recall if they have ever blinked. I was a bit weirded out, especially since I wasn't wearing my skull mask. I didn't even think to wave back a hello. So I just ignored them and listened further to the lady's interesting lecture, helping me examine my aura. At the same time, I couldn't help but feel stared down from the distance. I looked ahead again, and it was the same group checking me out. They just kept looking at me without even signaling me to walk over to their table. I knew I wasn't hallucinating because I blinked and the group was still there, not making a single move. To be honest, I swear I've never met this group before, so I really don't know why they were staring at me like they already knew me closely. While not making it a big deal, the lady finished up what she wanted to teach me. I paid her, and I just got up to go to the restroom. I just brushed off that stranger experience as nothing. Afterward, my friend found me and we just chatted until he had to leave for his mother's birthday outing. Interestingly enough, I then realized that the group never approached me after my aura session. I wondered what that was all about. Out of stubborn curiosity, I searched through the entire venue and still didn't find them. Good thing I didn't have to tell a man that I had teeth inside my rear end to scare him off. Well, that's pretty much it, and hopefully you are never as spooked as I was. This happened around 2006. I was 12 years old at the time. At the time, my grandparents used to live in a small house beside a big lake called Lagoa do Amaru in the countryside of Santa Catarina, Brazil. My cousins and I used to spend days, sometimes weeks, in their house, especially during our school vacations. It was a funny and cool place to stay. The house had an enormous plot of land where we used to play soccer and do kid stuff, and a private pier at the end of it from where we would jump into the lake during the hot Brazilian summer days. Some land next to my grandfather's land was occupied by my grandma's sister's house, and the other side was unoccupied. It was just wooded with a public pier, probably double the size of my grandpa's private pier. The public pier was way wider, probably around 1.5 meters, and had around 50 meters from end to end. It was perfect for us kids to run together and jump into the lake. Also, we felt we had more privacy there, far away from our grandparents' view. One night, around midnight, I had 3 cousins decided to go to the end of the public pier to relax a little and just kid around. So we silently left my grandpa's house, jumped the fence to the next land plot, and went straight to the end of the public pier. We stood there for about 35 minutes, messing around and talking to each other. That's when my cousin first saw him, a man with a yellow dirty raincoat that was almost brown at the beginning of the pier. We just stood there silently staring at him and at each other. That's when he started walking slowly towards the end of the pier. At the time, there was no light pole at the beginning of the pier, just at the end of it, because that's where the fishermen would stand to do their business. So we just stared at him, not being able to recognize him, or at least to see if he was carrying something. The man continued his walking, and when he reached the first light pole, where we started being able to recognize his features, he stopped. Then we could finally see him. An old man, probably around 55 to 60 years old, with missing teeth, a big gray beard, and a strange smile on his face, like he really wanted to laugh, but couldn't. At this moment, everyone was kind of freaking out because he had no escape route from there. It was just a lake, and nobody wanted to show up at Grandpa's house all wet with regular clothes after midnight, especially when we had left the house secretly, right? We could see that he had no fishing rod with him, but started to mimic like we were fishing some big and heavy fish on the lake, but in a really exaggerated way, like he was a cartoon character. He was already creeping us out with this. That's when it got scarier. The man suddenly turned to us with a sad face, like we were sad that he didn't catch his imaginary fish, and mimicked casting the baiting fish line into us, waited 2 seconds, and started winding the imaginary heel to wind in the line. But instead of making the pulling line movement as he did before, he started to jump closer to us every turn of his heel, like he was being pulled by us. That's when we decided we had enough, and that being grounded was probably better than being killed or raped by some mimicking maniac. All 4 of us jumped into the lake and started swimming to my grandpa's pier. When we got there, probably around 15 seconds later, the man was nowhere to be found. To this day, I don't know what he was planning to do to us, but there's something about that mimicking fisherman that I can't forget until this day, 15 years later. I'm not the one that believes in the supernatural, like ghosts or anything. I do believe in God and His holy word, but what happened to me has my world turned upside down, even until this day. I'm a 40-year-old male, but when this happened, I was 24 years old. It makes me feel old to say this, but Facebook hadn't become popular yet. Heck, I had never even heard of MySpace yet. Well, I started a Facebook account to keep up with my family in this state and in all the other states. 3 days after I started that Facebook account, this woman that looked my age sent me a friend request. I thought she was beautiful, so I accepted her request. Let's call her T to protect her family. After talking for a couple of weeks, we went out on our first date. No, this is not where it gets weird yet. Me and T dated for about a month before I got to meet her 2 kids. I'll just leave their names out completely. A couple of weeks later, I met her mom and dad, and she met my family. It really was going great with T and me, like a match made in heaven. On the weekends, I would sleep over at her house. We would take the kids to the movies, out to eat, and even Tannehill State Park. We got along so great together, I even got along with her kids and family. Well, I talked to her dad and asked if I could marry his daughter. Yes, I'm old-fashioned. He said yes. I went and bought the ring and called T up and asked if we could go out to eat the following weekend. Now this is the part where it started to get weird. That following weekend, I was nervous as all get out. I just couldn't wait. I left my house so I could be at hers on time. Now when I got to her house, it was all boarded up. So I went up to her parents' house. Her dad asked, "Can I help you?" So I just asked him, "What happened to T and the house? Did it catch on fire?" He looked at me as if I was crazy. He asked, "How do I know his great-great-great-great-grandmother? How do I know the house burnt down?" I asked, "When the house burnt..." "What? Your great-great-great who now?" "No, T is your daughter. I have pictures to prove it." So I showed him pictures that were supposed to be pictures of me, her, and the kids, but they were just pictures of me. No, my family didn't remember meeting her either. Like I said, I don't believe in ghosts, but what happened to me that year changed me. I can't date human women anymore. I tried a couple of times. It just ain't the same. So I'm waiting for T to come back, or someone else like her. For whatever reason, I wasn't at school. It wasn't a holiday or half term because I remember everyone else was at school. Anyway, we lived in northwest London at the time, and my mom said I could play outside on my bike, so off I went. I decided to leave my bike outside and just wander about. Anyway, after about an hour, I noticed a van that seemed to be wherever I was. There was an open block of flats. We lived on the first floor. I decided to pick some daisies and give them to Lila, one of the ladies on one of the top floors. As I went up the stairs, I heard the van doors closing, and one of the men said, "You get the lift, I'll take the stairs." I instantly knew I was in danger. I went to Lila's, and there was no answer. By now, I can hear the man on the stairs, Lala's neighbor had a huge plant pot outside the door, so I crouched down and hid for a few minutes. When I was sure the man had gone further up the stairs, I bolted down them and went running home. As I did this, I had to pass the van. As I passed it, I could hear what sounded like kids crying in the van. That scared me more, and I ran home screaming. One of the men was chasing me, and as soon as I got to the door, I ran in. But instead of crying for my mom, I started screaming, "Daddy, there's men trying to get me!" I knew my dad was at work and only my mom was in, but I screamed "Daddy" anyway. Anyway, the police showed up and asked me all sorts of questions. There was a heightened police presence in the area for ages, and I wasn't allowed out on my own again. None of us were. Fast forward like 20 years, my mom tells me that 2 kids had gone missing, and it was all on the local news. Shortly after my incident, the police received a tip-off and located the men. I didn't understand why they came back a few weeks later showing me pictures of people. But there amongst them was one of the men. I pointed him out immediately. Turns out he was one of the men the police had located along with the van I described and the bodies of the 2 missing children. The police told my mom it was my instinct that saved me, and the fact I screamed for my dad rather than my mom discouraged the men from entering our home. I'm a mother myself now, and to this day, I never let my kids play out alone. First off, this isn't my story, but rather my mother's. The first time I heard this, I was about 12 years old, and ever since then, I've never been able to forget it. When my mom was a little girl, her family moved into a small house in Lansing, Michigan. My mother said that immediately she got this overwhelming feeling of uneasiness when she first walked through the threshold and that she knew something wasn't right. Within a few weeks, she started having insanely intense night terrors about a man in a hat, which she called the Hat Man. She said that he started out just standing outside of her window, staring in, but as time progressed, he made it to the corner of the room and then to the end of her bed, and then finally standing right over her. She said, and I quote, "It was terrifying because I couldn't see his face no matter how hard I tried or how close he was. What made it worse is that he just had this malevolent, evil energy that made me sick whenever he was in my room." After weeks of complaining to her parents about the Hat Man, they took her to the doctor and she was prescribed sleeping pills. And of course, they didn't work. The night terrors continued. By this time, her birthday had rolled around and her parents gave her a baby doll. It was one that laughed and crawled when you put batteries in it and switched it on. Immediately, my mom was scared of it because that very night my mom woke up to the doll laughing and crawling across the floor as the Hat Man stood looming over it. This happened for several nights before my mom's parents finally duct taped the switch so that it remained in the off position. But alas, the doll still laughed and crawled in the middle of the night. So instead of throwing it away, my mom's parents decided to take the batteries out and pray that it didn't happen again. The doll didn't move for a few nights and my mom thought she was out of the woods, but she was wrong. One night, my grandma was woken up by laughter in the living room in the middle of the night. Of course, she just assumed it was one of her daughters, so she walked out of the living room, but what she saw stopped her dead in her tracks. Her hair stood on end as she witnessed the baby doll that didn't have batteries in it, crawling right at her. Meanwhile, my mom was lying in bed unable to move as the Hat Man stood over her. Finally, she was able to scream and her mother came rushing in. There isn't much to the story after that, except for the fact that they moved houses not long after, and my mother still sees the man to this day standing over her bed. However, recently I decided to Google the Hat Man. Turns out many people from all over the globe have seen this very same entity. But what really gets me is that they describe his energy and the way it looks the same way. Evil. So one time, me and 2 of my friends were chilling in my living room. My 2 friends were both sitting on the couch about 6 to 7 feet from me, and I was laying back in my lazy boy chair. I was getting drowsy, and I thought I might take a little nap, and I started getting a tad cold. I need to mention here that I had been unconsciously holding onto a cigarette lighter in one hand that had a metal lighter case on it. Anyway, since I was beginning to get a bit chilly, I went to put my arms underneath me to warm them up. The second I did that, I started being electrocuted. And I don't mean shocked like some static electricity or something. I mean my entire body was convulsing uncontrollably. I remember in that instant putting every ounce of my focus and energy into attempting to stand up, and after a few short seconds I was able to. The moment I was able to, the electricity stopped shocking me and I stood there flabbergasted. I was not sure what the heck just happened, and what's even weirder is that neither of my friends had even noticed what had just happened. When I told them, they didn't believe me, and they didn't really make a lick of sense to either since I hadn't been touching or even near touching anything electrical or that could conduct electricity. One of my friends turned the chair I'd been sitting in over and helped me look everywhere around for some kind of explanation as to how it might have happened. We never found anything. But a few minutes later, as I sat trying to convince both of them that it really happened, I opened my hand up and set the lighter down. And on my hand sat a little square burn, the same shape as the metal lighter case I had been holding in my hand when it happened. Suffice it to say, that was only one of the crazy things that's ever happened to me, but the burn was proof it had really happened, and I still have no clue how I was able to get my body to stand up or how I knew that that's what would make it stop. But it did. I still have no idea how I got shocked so dramatically from sitting in a cushioned chair, but it happened. This story takes place in August of 2001 in a town an hour away from New York City. I had just turned 12 and was playing with some neighborhood kids on a Saturday afternoon. We decided to play tag, and when we were finished, my friend Tommy suggested we play manhunt that night. A few of the older neighborhood kids overheard us and told us they'd be there too. I didn't tell my parents that I'd be going to play manhunt at night with the neighborhood kids because I knew they'd say no. So I decided then and there to sneak out. It made me nervous knowing I would have to sneak out of the house and avoid my grandfather setting the alarm, but I wouldn't have missed my first game of manhunt for the world. I felt as though it was a rite of passage into my preteen years, so I reassured that I wouldn't be locked out and planned my escape. I waited until 7:30 when dinner had been eaten and cleaned up, and I snuck out of my room, down the stairs, past my grandmother asleep in her chair, and then out the front door, being careful to turn the knob as silently as possible. I then booked it up the street to where we were going to play manhunt. The older kids were behind some pine trees which separated the townhouses from another plot of land. This property was further up our street, and on it sat a small barn and a small farmhouse. We all gathered in front of the farmhouse and milled about for a few minutes. I took note that there wasn't a driveway leading to the house from anywhere, so this house must have been pretty old. I also noticed that the outside of the house looked rather old-fashioned. For a town with so much money, this house stuck out. I wondered why I had never seen this place before, despite all the playing outside that the kids in the neighborhood used to do. Finally, the three older kids called everyone up to the front of the house and got us to quiet down. One of the kids started explaining that the house we were standing in front of is haunted. No sooner had he said that, the rest of us started yelling and protesting and asking what we were doing there. Once the older kid silenced the group, an older kid named Mike started explaining the story of why the house was haunted. The story went something like this. In the 1950s, there was a family who lived on the farm. The family had a mother, a father, and two sons, one younger and one older. The father and sons worked in the city, and the mother stayed home and took care of the house and the farm animals. The family had chickens, dogs, cats, and a white show horse named Spirit. The horse was given to the wife as a wedding gift, and she took care of it very well. The wife loved that horse like it was a member of the family. The horse was also given the freedom to walk about the area during the day, and when the family would call to it at dusk, it would come trotting home. One day, when the father and sons were driving home from the city after work, their car lost control in a bad storm and flew off the bridge. The father and sons were killed in the crash. The wife stayed up all night waiting for the rest of her family to come home, but they never did. The next morning, the police came to the door and told the wife what happened, and she was very upset. After the funeral, she stopped going shopping and showing her face in public. Once 3 months had passed, the police went to check on her. The police rang the bell and knocked loudly to get the wife's attention, but no one answered the door. The police eventually broke the door down to get into the house. When they got in, they smelled something horrible. The smell was so bad that one of the cops vomited. The cops soon realized that the smell was coming from the living room. Once they entered the room, they discovered the wife's body, which was rotting into the couch. She had died some time ago, most likely from a broken heart. The police were getting ready to call for backup in an ambulance when they saw something on the wall that made them run screaming from the house. Spirit, the prize show horse, had been beheaded. His head and neck were hung on the wall like someone would mount a deer head, only the head wasn't taxidermied. There must have still been bones and muscles and organs in the horse's head when it was put onto the wall. There was a large blood stain behind the horse's head and blood running down the wall, which left a pool on the floor. As the police called for backup, they realized that the family's chickens were all gone because the gate had been left open. Wild animals must have gotten to the chickens, and the dogs and cats were nowhere in sight. After the body of the wife was buried, an investigation was opened. After only a few weeks, the police investigation concluded that the wife went crazy after the news and must have killed the horse in a fit of mental anguish and then died of starvation herself. The police had found the wife's body in late October, and sometimes around Halloween, the ghost of the horse can be seen running around the woods, making no noise as it gallops over fallen leaves and rocks. By the time the story was over, twilight had just settled in over our heads. All of us younger kids were either completely grossed out or fascinated and talked excitedly. I was the former. Once we all settled, the older kids took out a flashlight and asked us who wanted to go inside the farmhouse. We all backed up and protested, but they were insistent. Mike pointed at my friend Tommy and then me and said that we should go into the farmhouse. Tommy was brave and spoke first, saying he would do it while taking the flashlight and shoving the older kids out of the way. I didn't say a word to the older kids, but I perked up and told Tommy to wait for me as I followed him closer to the house. We walked up to the farmhouse side by side with Tommy holding the flashlight. I walked up the small staircase first and pulled open the door for Tommy. As soon as we swung the door open, a foul stench wafted into our respective nostrils. I had smelled roadkill in the summertime before, but this was 10 times worse. Tommy grabbed his nose as I stood there coughing. We pulled the collars of our shirts up over our noses and pressed on. All of the neighborhood kids were talking excitedly as we walked in, but as soon as we disappeared from view, they all fell deathly silent. I was half expecting one of the old neighborhood kids to jump out and scare us at any point, so I was breathing deeply into my shirt, preparing for what I thought was the inevitable jump scare. Tommy and I turned right in the house, which opened up to the living room. On the far wall of the living room, the flashlight illuminated an old sunken-in sand-colored couch that was stained with what I can only describe as thick, black, dried gunk. The smell hit us again once we realized where it was coming from. This must have been the couch that the wife had died on. We both gagged and had to hold back the overwhelming urge to vomit. Tommy said we should leave now, and I agreed. As we turned to leave the house, his flashlight illuminated a wall on the left side of the living room, which we hadn't seen as we entered. On the wall was a large ovular blood stain with dried blood running down the wall and a pool of dried blood on the floor in front of the wall. Tommy and I looked at each other in the dim light, screamed bloody murder, and bolted from the house. I was so averse to staying a minute longer that I took off like a shot down the hill and sprinted all the way home. Once I got to the front porch of my house, I took a minute to catch my breath. I peered in the narrow window next to the door to see whether the house alarm had been set. It was still not set, so I ever so gently pulled the storm door open, followed by the front door, and let myself in. I snuck upstairs to my room and stayed there for the rest of the night. Only a small handful of people have heard this story throughout the years, and the main reason I've not told it is that the other kids in the neighborhood might very well have been playing a prank on us. They were in early high school and could have easily set up the abandoned house to show exactly what a potentially made-up story mentioned. There is an epilogue to this story though. My younger sister Gina and I were taking a short walk on a brisk day in October. A few months later, we had gone down to the end of our road, which ended in a cul-de-sac. There was a gate at one end, which was open in the summer, which allowed cars access to a swimming pool. Gina and I walked around the gate and kept going toward the pool. There were thick woods on the left side of the road, which went back quite some way. As Gina and I got closer to the pool, she tapped my left shoulder with the back of her hand and asked if I saw what she saw. I turned left to face the woods and saw a white figure quickly moving through the woods. I said I didn't know, but that it looked like it was on 4 legs. When she suggested that it looked like a horse, my jaw dropped open. I hadn't told her about the night at the farmhouse prior to this for fear that she'd tell my parents I had snuck out. There was no way she could have known that I'd have such a reaction. We both stared at it silently as the ghost of spirit galloped through the woods at a breakneck pace without so much of a hoofbeat. I turned back to her, eyes wide, and suggested we go home now. We made it home, and I finally told her the story that I had heard months before. Back when I was attending a university, I used to work on campus at one of the dining halls during the dinner/night shift. I lived in the next town over since it was cheaper to live in a crappy little apartment out of town than to live on campus in the dorms. But I didn't own a car, so I had to take the bus. One night, I had just gotten off a shift at work. My feet were killing me, and I was completely exhausted as I slowly made my way to the bus stop. I noticed a man much older than me sitting on one of the 2 benches at the otherwise empty bus stop, but I didn't pay too much attention to him. I simply sat down on the second bench and listened to some music while waiting for the bus to arrive. The first sign that things were starting to get weird was when I kept noticing out the corner of my eye that he was just staring at me. At first, I thought I might be imagining it, so I looked over and caught him quickly turning his head to look away. Okay, so he was staring at me. This wasn't completely out of the ordinary, since being a young college girl seemed to gain me a bit of attention from older men. So like usual, I just ignored him. That was a mistake. Again, out of the corner of my eye, I saw him look at me, but instead of just staring this time, he got up and walked over to sit next to me instead. I continued listening to my music, hoping that he'd see the earbuds and take the hint that I wasn't interested in having a conversation. Instead, this man literally took the earbud out of my ear. "Hey there, sweetheart," he said as my head snapped to look at him in shock. I should have told him off for touching my things and demanded he leave me alone, but I was sort of frozen and didn't want to make him mad. Hi?" I replied quietly. He started introducing himself as Mike and telling me that he lived in the area and it was always nice to see pretty girls like me at the university bus stop. He explained that he was a real man, unlike the boys I went to school with, and that I should go home with him that night. I was a shy, scared virgin who had never had a man be as bold as this to my face. I say to my face because I had certainly gotten my fair share of unsolicited private pictures online by that point, but I digress. I didn't know how to respond, so I didn't. But that didn't stop Mike from continuing to explain to me all the fun things he wanted to do with me at his place that night. He got into graphic detail. The things he described started out with the basic things you'd expect and escalated to him asking if I liked being choked until I turned purple and passed out in bed. I wish there were anyone else at this bus stop, but it was just the 2 of us, in the dark alone as I counted the seconds until the bus would arrive. Then Mike took things to a different level of shocking by telling me, "Listen, the demons want me to ask for your phone number, and they say you should give it to me or you won't like what happens." He actually had the audacity to start stroking my hair. His hand was gentle, but I didn't want him touching me at all. This was shocking for a number of reasons. The demons? I wouldn't like what would happen. Why was he touching me? What the heck was this guy talking about? As though he could read my mind, Mike went on to explain, "My therapist knows the demons are real. I told her about them, and she says I'm not crazy, and the demons are real." He laughed, then abruptly stopped. "Oh, give me your phone number like they said," he demanded, and his hand stroked my hair for the last time. He stopped and gripped the back of my neck, still gentle, but even more terrifying. I was scared and obviously didn't want him to have my phone number, but he was taking out his phone, and I knew that he was going to call the number I gave him to make sure I wasn't lying to him. And he still had his hand on the back of my neck, so I reluctantly gave him my real phone number. Stupid, I know. But I was right, and he immediately called to check. All I could think about was just not making this guy angry long enough to get away from him, and then I'd block his number. Thankfully, the bus came moments later. I sat down as close to the front of the bus near the bus driver as I possibly could since the bus was basically empty. Mike decided to sit directly across from me. At this point, I had tried listening to music again, hoping that being on the bus and him having my phone number would signal to him the end of our conversation. However, he decided to reach over and unzip my sweatshirt, revealing my work shirt and the name tag, which I had unfortunately forgotten to remove in my haste to leave work that night. I hadn't told him my name yet. Abigail. What a beautiful name. Our daughter will be named Celeste. I shouldn't have been shocked at this point, but I was. I had stopped listening to music again and zipped my sweatshirt back up, which made him laugh. You won't need that soon anyway, he said, and winked at me, implying how he'd planned to undress me even further that night. At one stop, Mike tried to convince me to get off the bus with him. I told him no, that I was tired and just wanted to go home. So he said okay, and stayed on the bus. The fact he was staying on the bus worried me. I was sure this meant that he was planning on coming home with me instead. Baby, Mike whispered to me. I tried to ignore him, but he repeated himself louder. Baby. He had the most unsettling smile on his face as I asked, What? He laughed and told me, The demons say you smell nice. I was terrified and felt like I was going to throw up by the time my bus stop arrived. I lived in an apartment alone and didn't want him to know where I lived. Despite my body being exhausted and sore from work, adrenaline kicked in and I bolted off the bus and ran straight home. I made it inside and locked the door. I looked through the peephole and didn't see him, so I went to carefully peek out my window and saw him standing near the bus stop looking around. He took out his phone and sure enough, I started getting a call from an unknown number since I hadn't saved his number. I ignored it. When he hung up, I started getting several texts asking where I'd gone, how he didn't like hide and seek, and how the demons just wanted to have fun. I was so scared because he knew which apartment building I lived in, where I worked, where I went to school, my phone number, and my name. The only good thing which made me feel slightly relieved was that he didn't know which specific apartment number I lived in. That's when he started yelling outside. There were no specific words said, just wordless yells of what I can only assume were frustration and anger. I blocked his number and kept all the lights in my apartment off as I cried with my back to the front door. Maybe I should have called the police, but my brain was so frazzled that I didn't even think of that until the next day. And by then, all I knew about him was that he was a mentally unstable man, probably named Mike, who hadn't actually done any physical harm to me, so I didn't think it was worth it. In hindsight, I know that I made a lot of stupid mistakes during this experience. I ended up moving away entirely at the end of that term of school for unrelated reasons, but until then, I switched to day shifts at work and was paranoid every night. Thankfully, I never saw the man again though. I was only about 4 years old at the time. I was playing hide and seek with my big sisters. I had thought about hiding in my parents' closet, but decided to hide under their bed instead. I was facing into the room so I could see when the seeker came in. I saw the middle sister, B, come in and hide in the closet. For some reason, the door was already open, so she left it that way and hid in the back corner. I was little enough and the bed was high enough off the ground that I could put my chin on my hands and have my head straight, rather than having to press an ear to the ground. The counting finished and my eldest sister, N, began her seeking mission. Maybe not even a minute into the search, I'm looking at the closet, and my mom still had her wedding dress hanging up. I watched as the arms on the dress lifted at the same time, and the dress jerked on its hanger towards B. She screamed and went running for our mom, and I wiggled my way out of my hiding place. I found everyone in the kitchen, Mom trying to calm down my terrified sister and the other sister with a look of confusion on her face. B is trying to tell my mom what happened, but can't seem to get the words out. All I can remember is her saying dress and arms. I went over and tugged at my mom's shirt to get her attention. Not now, she said. But I saw it, I told her. That got her attention. Saw what? Your dress. Its arms lifted up by themselves, and it moved on the rail. That's why B is crying. Mom ushered us all down to the room with her, and the dress was in the same place she had last seen it, hanging limply and forlorn. You must have imagined it, Mom told me. But then why is B crying? I asked. B was standing in the doorway of the room, refusing to get any closer to the closet. How did you see it if you were hiding? Mom asked, so I wiggled my way back under the bed to show them, and I had a clear view up to the shelf in the closet. What I didn't know was that B had also seen a face, as if someone were wearing the dress and trying to reach out to her. There was a psychic living at the top of our street at the time, so the next day we all trooped off to see her. She told Mom it was our Nana, her mother, who had died the previous year. We didn't believe her though, because we'd seen Nan before, and she'd never done anything to scare us. We never did find out who or what it really was. B still won't talk about it and refuses to acknowledge any paranormal happenings in that house. There are a lot of stories from that house, but nearly 30 years later, Nan still comes to visit. In fact, all my grandparents still visit. I know who it is by the scent. Potpourri for my mom's mom, burnt toast for her dad, tobacco for my dad's dad, and for his mom, her favorite perfume.